What is up, party people? It's Keys Dan with RadioWhat.com, DJLittleRock.com, coming to you live and in living color from the Radio What studio. And this is my podcast, What Makes You Famous. It's an extension of the RadioWhat.com internet radio station that I've been running for quite some time. And if you need DJ services, where do you go? DJLittleRock.com. Check availability and get a free price quote. And maybe you could have me. Oh yeah, I like to play for the people at your next event. You know, I like weddings and parties of all kinds. Video dance party karaoke jams have been what's going on lately. If you'd like to tell your story, I encourage you to check out my other podcast, What Makes You Famous. Find it everywhere using the hashtag What Makes You Famous.
Now, on with the show. Today on the program, 10 things you need to know today for Saturday, May 30th, 2020. 10 things you need to know today. Number 1, protests against police brutality escalate nationwide. Protesters gathered in several cities across the U.S. on Friday night to demonstrate against police brutality and institutional racism. Protests in Brooklyn, New York, Atlanta, Georgia, San Jose, California, Washington, D.C., and Minneapolis, Minnesota started peacefully, with attendees demanding justice in the case of George Floyd, who died in Minneapolis after a police officer kneeled on his neck for several minutes on Monday. Some protesters clashed with police. In Brooklyn, where a heavy police presence awaited protesters, officers reportedly used tear gas on crowds. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, a police car was reportedly set on fire. In San Jose, protesters blocked freeway traffic. And in D.C., the White House was briefly on lockdown as demonstrators arrived in the area. This is according to CNN and the New York Times. Number 2, states call in National Guard amid protests. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, Republican, declared a state of emergency early Saturday in the wake of protests in Atlanta against police brutality. Kemp said, at the request of Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, 500 members of the National Guard would deploy immediately, quote, to protect people and property, end quote, in the city. In Minneapolis, where the protest originated following the death of George Floyd, 500 Guard soldiers were deployed Friday, while Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Democrat, said Saturday he was moving to activate 1,000 more, which would result in the largest civilian deployment in the state's history. Walz also said he is considering federal help, and the Associated Press reports that the Pentagon ordered the Army to put active duty military police on standby for deployment to Minneapolis. This is according to the Associated Press and CBS Minnesota. Number 3, Trump says U.S. is terminating relationship with WHO. President Trump on Friday said the U.S. is, quote, terminating, end quote, its relationship with the World Health Organization. Trump previously criticized the WHO for what he says were, quote, repeated missteps, end quote, while responding to the coronavirus pandemic. The president also previously temporarily froze U.S. funding to the WHO, saying it ignored early signs of the coronavirus. He threatened to make the freeze permanent if the organization did not, quote, clean up their act, end quote. On Friday, Trump said the U.S. would reshuffle its $450 million annual contribution to the WHO to other health groups, noted that China gives $40 million, and claimed without proof that the organization is controlled by Beijing. The move leaves the WHO without its largest financial backer. Trump also said the U.S. would begin the process of ending its special relationship with Hong Kong. This is according to the Associated Press and the New York Times. Number 4, ex-Minneapolis police officer arrested, charged over George Floyd's death. Ex-Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was arrested Friday in connection to George Floyd's death, Public Safety Commissioner John Harrington announced. Chauvin was filmed kneeling on Floyd's neck for several minutes during an arrest on Monday, while Floyd repeatedly said he could not breathe. Floyd, who is black, later died, and Chauvin, who is white, was fired on Tuesday. Protests over Floyd's death and the handling of the case have roiled Minneapolis for several days, though Hennepin County Attorney Michael Freeman, the main prosecutor in Minneapolis, urged patience and restraint as the investigation continued. Chauvin was charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter. This is according to Representative Dean Phillips and the Star Tribune. Number 5, Trump offers sympathy to Floyd family, defends looting and shooting tweet. President Trump on Friday offered his condolences to the family of George Floyd, who died while in police custody in Minneapolis, and said he's asked the Department of Justice to expedite the investigation into his death. Quote, "We're determined that justice will be served," end quote, he said. Quote, "I understand the hurt. I understand the pain," end quote. Asked about his Thursday night tweet in which he warned the National Guard would, quote, "assume control," end quote, if looting and arson continued amid Minneapolis protest, and wrote, quote, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts," end quote. Trump said he simply meant looting often leads to violence. The phrase was infamously first used by a racist Miami police chief in 1967 when cracking down on black neighborhoods. Trump insisted he did not know about the origin of the phrase. His tweet garnered a warning label from Twitter about glorifying violence. This is according to C-SPAN and CNN. Number 6, consumer spending dropped around 13.6% in April. On Friday, the government reported that consumer spending in April plunged 13.6% from the month prior, which Bloomberg says is, quote, "the sharpest drop in Commerce Department records back to 1959, end quote. Meanwhile, the personal savings rate, which describes the amount of a person's disposable income that they are putting into savings, hit 33% in April, quote, "by far the highest since the department started tracking in the 1960s, and surpassing the consumer savings during the global financial crisis," end quote, CBS reports. The high personal savings rate, combined with the extremely low customer spending, reflects Americans' jitters about spending money during the pandemic. Personal income, meanwhile, rose 10.5% in April, a record boost due to the federal stimulus payments and unemployment benefits, while economists had expected a decrease of 2.1%. This is according to Bloomberg and CNBC. Number 7, CDC chief says agency wouldn't have been able to detect coronavirus early, even with widespread testing. Center for Disease Control and Prevention Director Robert Redfield said Friday that a new analysis shows the agency would not have been able to detect the spread of the coronavirus if widespread testing had been available earlier because the virus was circulating at low levels for a good amount of January and February. Quote, "It really would be like looking for a needle in a haystack," end quote, he said. The CDC's initial response to the outbreak has been criticized, especially over testing rollout, which was delayed because of a flawed prototype. Other experts didn't buy Redfield's defense, however, noting that, quote, "targeting surveillance," end quote, rather than, quote, "widespread testing," end quote, was necessary in the early days. This is according to the Washington Post and NPR. Number 8, Merkel turns down Trump's G7 invitation. German Chancellor Angela Merkel on Friday turned down President Trump's invitation to attend the Group of 7 summit in person because of concerns over the coronavirus pandemic. The White House has said the summit will go forward in late June in Washington, D.C., rather than at Camp David as previously planned. Quote, "As of today, considering the overall pandemic situation, Merkel cannot agree to her personal participation," end quote, German government spokesman Steffen Seibert told Politico. The chancellor will reportedly continue to monitor the coronavirus situation. However, Trump and Merkel haven't always seen eye to eye, and the leaders reportedly had heated disagreements over NATO, China, and the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline during a phone call last week, though it's unclear if that conversation had any bearing on Merkel's decision about the summit. This is according to Politico and Al Jazeera. Number 9, Supreme Court rejects church's challenge to California's religious services restrictions. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court on Friday rejected a California church's challenge to the state's limits on attendance for religious services during the coronavirus pandemic. For now, California can enforce the rules as a public health measure. The court was split on ideological lines, with Chief Justice John Roberts, who often serves as the swing vote, siding with the liberal faction. In the ruling, Roberts wrote that, quote, the precise question when restrictions, end quote, should be lifted during the pandemic, quote, is a dynamic and fact-intensive matter, subject to reasonable disagreement, end quote. And the, quote, Constitution principally entrusts the safety and the health of the people to the politically accountable officials of the states, end quote. This is according to the Wall Street Journal and the Los Angeles Times. Number 10, rescheduled SpaceX launch could be disrupted by weather again, officials say. Officials in Florida said on Friday that SpaceX's rescheduled first launch of astronauts could again be disrupted by bad weather. The SpaceX and NASA joint mission was supposed to launch on Wednesday, seeking to be the first to send humans into orbit from U.S. soil in nearly a decade, and the first time a private company has put astronauts into space. But it was canceled just minutes before takeoff amid lightning and rain. It was rescheduled for Saturday at 3:22 p.m. Eastern Time, but forecasts show a 50% chance of rain and clouds. The backup plan is to launch at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on Sunday. President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence had arrived in Kennedy Space Center in Florida to watch SpaceX's Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon spacecraft take off and are planning to return on Saturday. This is according to the New York Times and Space.com. That's 10 things you need to know today for Saturday, May 30th, 2020. Thank you so much for listening. This has been What Makes You Smarter. If you'd like to tell your story or hear the stories of others, I encourage you to check out my other podcast, What Makes You Famous. Find it everywhere using the hashtag What Makes You Famous. I hope everyone's doing reasonably well out there. Drop me some comments. Let me know what you're up to at this time. That's it for me. It's Keys Dan, RadioWhat.com, DJLittleRock.com. Peace. I'm out of here.
If you like what you hear, I encourage you to follow What Makes You Smarter on social media. Find it on Facebook at What Makes You Smarter, Instagram at What Makes You Smarter, Twitter at SmarterWhat, and YouTube, username Keys Dan. Leave What Makes You Smarter podcast a review and subscribe. Listen to What Makes You Smarter podcast on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Podcast Addict. My personal favorite, learn with me on my podcast, What Makes You Smarter. And if you'd like to tell your story, I encourage you to check out my other podcast, What Makes You Famous. Find it everywhere using the hashtag What Makes You Famous. Call 501-470-6386 and leave a message to set up a time for What Makes You Famous. Support What Makes You Smarter podcast using the PayPal, paypal.me/Keys Dan. Email info@radiowhat.com. What Makes You Smarter is a production of Keys Dan Enterprises Incorporated at keysdan.com. Thank you for listening.